8 May 1945. Kassel. In a school exercise book with a torn cover, a 19-year-old clerk without a uniform wrote by candle stub, "We will build a new Germany with the same hands that destroyed the old one, and we will not admit it until the work is done." His name was Karl. He wrote his surname with neat strokes, then scratched it out, as if the page itself might one day be interrogated. Outside, there was no quiet. Kassel had been bombed 3 times with fire and steel. A British raid in October 1943 turned the centre into a furnace and left the medieval streets as lines on a map without buildings. The last raids came in March 1945. On 4 April, American troops reached the Fulda River. 8 days later, the last shots in Kassel were fired. The city was a topography of absence. Staircases climbed to nowhere. Walls stood without roofs like jawbones without teeth. The mathematics of even thinking about a home was subtraction upon subtraction. He walked out into the noon. The smell was damp plaster, ash, cabbage boiled to a thread. Women with red scarves and flat shoes pulled at bricks, stacking whole ones on one side and rubble on the other. The word Trümmerfrauen would become a motif, then a myth, then a memory. It was also a labor detail recorded in occupation reports with dates, numbers, and the calories to be issued for a day with a wheelbarrow. There were missing family members. A father reported Verschollen Ostfront since late 1944, a cousin last seen near the Oder in February, a school friend who had been a boy in the classroom and became a man in a trench after a week. Absence was a census method. The Allied reports and German municipal lists began to track the missing, each column a quiet morgue of lines. The occupation forces entered, not as a single force, but as Americans in jeeps with photographers and interpreters, with paper and stamps. Curfew from 2,100 hours to 0500. A ban on gatherings without permits. A ban on former party officials holding office. Posters in German and English, with orders and prohibitions. A fragile quiet enforced by MPs with jeeps and by hunger with empty placards. In an Allied intelligence summary compiled in Frankfurt that June, Kassel is noted as cooperative, considerable physical destruction, population demoralized but compliant, food situation critical. The fear of retribution was not abstract. Posters with photographs of what had been unlocked at Dachau and Buchenwald appeared on walls and in cinemas with blackout curtains taped open. A film called Death Mills played in May and June. Reports from the Office of Military Government for Hesse list attendance numbers. The queues were shorter than the Allied officers hoped. Many came because it was ordered. Some came because it was nothing else to do at that hour before curfew. A headmaster wrote in a letter intercepted and translated by the Allies in July, "We stood in silence. People did not look at each other when the lights came up. Hunger was not rhetorical. The hunger winters of 1945-46 and 1946-47 were about arithmetic and weather. The total calories available per day were counted in municipal memos and kept like a kind of ledger of the body. A healthy adult needs 2,200 to 2,600 calories per day to work with their hands." In December 1946, in parts of Hesse, rations fell below 1,400, sometimes below 1,200. Kohlruben Swedes feed turnips, returned from animal troughs to kitchen tables. The Allied daily ration tables, released in red-coded monthly reports, show the numbers falling with the cold. There was a scourge of coughs and gastric fevers. There were ration cards with stamps that proved nothing could be bought because nothing was behind the counter. The black market grew like a fungus in wet wood. In Kassel's gutted centre, on the edges of Königsplatz, men with their collars up pressed packs of cigarettes into palms and slid watches across crates. cigarettes became arithmetic too, each one a unit of exchange. A pack of Lucky Strike was worth more than a day's manual labor. In occupation reports, cigarettes are called commodity money, and the term Zigarettenwährung appears in diaries as a bitter joke. A man who had never held a foreign coin now counted American brands with a practiced eye for tax stamps. Carl watched and learned the prices. He traded 3 packs for a pair of shoes for his mother. He wrote the numbers in his head and then scratched the lines out on the exercise book to leave no trace. In the lanes around the old Luther Kirsch ruins, he saw a woman who once wore a fur collar now trading the last piece of a family service for a bag of flour. He saw a boy, his own age, in a British uniform handing 2 cigarettes and a smile to a woman, his own age in a dress that was too thin for the weather. The fraternization ban shifted in practice long before it shifted on paper. On 20 May 1945, American soldiers knocked on the apartment that had once been half of a house. They had interpreters. They had clipboards. They asked who had been in the party. Names went into notebooks and then into files. Everyone who had held a post had their name read, checked, notched forward to the local denazification committees. Everybody who had been a member without a post filled out a questionnaire. The Firebombing was 16 pages long. It asked, when did you join which organizations? Were you a member of the SA, SS, NSKK, NSFK, NSV, DAF? Did you contribute to party causes? Did you attend meetings? Did you sign letters? The questions were not literary. They turned human trajectories into checkboxes. Karl had not been a member of the party. He had been a member of the Hitlerjugend because everyone in his class had been. The Firebombing called that compulsory. It did not absolve. It tabulated. In the American and British zones, denazification took the form of Sprüchkammern judgment chambers staffed by Germans under Allied oversight. Categories were assigned, like labels on suitcases. I, Hauptschuldiger, major offender. I, 2, belasteter, offender. I, 3, minder belasteter, lesser offender. IV, Mitlaufer, follower. V, Entlasteter, exonerated. He watched older men queue to enter a hall with a bench and a panel of 3 Germans and 1 American or British observer. A teacher from his school emerged pale and folded his paper and put it in his pocket. He would be rehired as a substitute 2 months later. In the denazification files of Hesse, which now sit in the Bundesarchiv and the Hessisches Hauptstaatsarchiv with call numbers and box labels, the arithmetic of guilt is written in typed lines. 3.66 million cases processed in the American zone by 1949, a fraction less than 1%. As major offenders, a larger fraction, less than 10%, as offenders or lesser offenders, the overwhelming majority listed as Mitlaufer or exonerated. Stability required a bureaucracy. The bureaucracy required people with skills. The men with skills often had been in the apparatus. The Sprüchkammern worked case by case. The system worked as a machine. The mathematics of guilt was also the arithmetic of staffing a city office. He found a job in 1946 in just such an office. The Wohnungsamt, the housing office, in a temporary building with tin walls near the Rathaus, which was roofed in tar paper and made habitable by brick dust and hot tea. The city's ledger showed a housing stock reduced by more than half inside the city limits. Refugees came into that ledger by the trainload. They arrived with canvas bundles and worn suitcases from Silesia, East Prussia, Pomerania, the Sudetenland. By 1946, in Hesse alone, the number of displaced Germans, the expellees, the Heimatvertriebene, swelled into the hundreds of thousands. By 1950, in the western zones, more than 79 million expellees had been resettled. In the whole of what would become West Germany, the total number was above 12 million. These numbers are not rhetorical. They show up in municipal minutes, in Bundesarchiv compilations, in the stamped forms that pass through Karl's hands. The arithmetic of rooms looked like this. A 3-room flat with 1 family becomes a 3-room flat with 2 families. Then with a widow and her child in the corner behind a curtain. Then with a cousin who has lost his papers and claims a space under the stairs. Decisions were written as allocations and concessions. A 1946 note on Karl's desk reads, "Immediate lodging required. Frau A. 2 children arrived today from Liegnitz. Cousin in the city. No billeting available. Suggest temporary shelter in school basement." The temporary part would stretch into months and then years. The tension between locals and newcomers was recorded in set phrases: burden to community, not integrated, reluctance to share scarce resources. There were fights in courtyards over coal deliveries. There were slashed tires on carts. There were petty acts of cruelty and generosity both. Oral histories recorded in Kassel and Göttingen decades later returned to the smell of wet wool and the sound of unfamiliar dialects carrying through thin coal smoke. Near Kassel, on a hill by Oberswerden, a cluster of barracks held lines of people under a new title, displaced persons. The Mattenberg DP camp was a world within walking distance, but separated by fences and American sentries. It was primarily Jewish, with survivors from Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the names on their tags written in English letters, their eyes older than their faces, their eyes older than their faces. A UN-ORA official wrote in a report in February 1946, "Camp conditions as of this date satisfactory, food adequate, morale complicated, repatriation desires mixed." Karl passed the wire on the way to a quarry shipment. A woman on the other side held a baby and looked past him. He had never seen a star stitched to a coat before the war ended. Now he saw numbers tattooed on forearms and did not know where to put his eyes. He wrote a line in his notebook that night and then crossed it out. The moment when Germans realized what had been done in their name did not come in a single revelation. It came in fragments. A poster, a rumor, a letter from a cousin in the East who had marched through places and learned to keep his mouth closed, an educational film with images that stayed in the corner of the eye. In October 1945, the Americans organized a tour of a former satellite camp outside the city. Municipal employees were required to attend. The Allied officer with a clipboard ticked off names at the gate. Some cried, some vomited, some watched and went home and folded the knowledge like a scorer's card and put it inside the cover of their Bible. Denial and selective memory mixed with fear and fatigue. There were sentences that began, "We didn't know," and paused after the comma. There were sentences that began, "If we had known," and ended with an ellipsis, because the speaker did not want to answer the second half. Church sermons in 1946 and 1947 sometimes spoke of sin and asked for forgiveness in general. Confessions were rare. In the files labeled Denazification and Public Opinion, created by OMG Use and later held in the National Archives and in the Bundesarchiv, the reports record a shift by mid-1946. Attention moves from the past to the present hunger and the future. The war is not over, one report notes. It has changed its tools. He lived the arithmetic of that change. Each day, stacks of forms, each with a name and a need. Twice a week, a visit from a British or American officer with a blue pencil to ask about compliance and public order. Here is where the mathematics of guilt met the arithmetic of rooms. A former party member, Category 3, came to the desk with a form from the Spruchkammer that said he could be employed again. He had a wife and a child and a mother-in-law. He had once been a section head in the housing office. Another man, an expellee, Category V, had no stamp but had a floor of a blown-out building to live on if he could persuade the office to issue him a key. The law did not imagine what the pile of forms would look like. The praxis was a shuffled deck. The clerk did not decide morality. He made arithmetic. He learned words that would govern his life. Perceelschein, a perceel certificate, named for the white of a washing powder, a letter of exoneration from a respected person attesting to non-involvement. He watched them pass across the counter, written by priests, by neighbors, by men who had stood in different lines at different times. He watched the practical need for trained men, engineers, foremen, accountants, silence the desire for thorough justice. A neighbor who had been excluded in 1945 returned to a desk in 1947. A police sergeant reappeared in uniform in 1948. The mathematics of guilt bent under the pressure of coal shortages and unemployment figures. The winter of 1946-47 was called a hunger winter in newspapers with small print and in diaries with larger letters. The frost did not let go. The unheated trains were records of endurance. The Ruhr mines produced less than planned because men fainted on the line. In Kassel, the municipal bulletin for January noted that office hours were reduced to 3 hours per day, that the bathhouse would be open every third day, that public kitchens would be set up in school gyms. He worked with gloves on and his breath made a cloud over the inkwell. That is the context in which the currency changed. On 20 June 1948, in the 3 Western zones, people lined up with their ration cards and their IDs at tables set up in schools and community halls. The Deutsche Mark was introduced. Each person received 40 marks at first, then 20 more. The Reichsmark notes that had been eroded by inflation and by the black market were withdrawn in stacks that looked like bricks. The arithmetic of prices reset overnight. Shop windows that had been bare for years suddenly had goods behind glass. The newsreels show density around the counters. The occupation reports show that the price adjustments were chaotic. Cigarettes were still currency, but the hand-to-hand market shrank. He watched the shop shelves fill with soap, with shirts, with tins of meat, with tools. He saw packets labeled ERP, European Recovery Program, stamped on crates in the municipal warehouse, wheat from Kansas, powdered egg, tinned milk, medical supplies. The Marshall Plan was not abstract. It manifested as lumpy sacks and oily smells. The bundles were weighed and recorded and distributed to a city that had learned to live on a ledger. In American reports, Kassel's reception of ERP aid is combined with Hess's, with tables listing tonnages and sectors: coal, steel, housing. Those sectors mattered. Factories that had been dismantled in 1945 and 1946 under the level of industry plan, their machine beds shipped east or west as reparations, were permitted to reopen. A few returned under new names or with new owners. In Kassel, the Henschel works that had built tanks and locomotives began to build trucks again. Manchester cloth appeared in tailors' windows. The Ruhr regained a rhythm, then a pace. The term Wirtschaftswunder would not be used widely until the 1950s, but its preconditions were in the careful accounting of 1948. He left the housing office in 1950. He went to Henschel as a clerk in wages and materials. He wrote hours onto pay slips. He sent letters to suppliers. He saw how a factory is a city with timesheets. He learned to use the new forms. He learned to read a balance sheet and a union contract. The coal shortage eased. The tram routes extended past the ruins with new stops. The rubble piles shrank. People used words like Aufschwung and Atemholen upswing and catching breath. The new democracy rested on unspoken bargains. The Basic Law of the Federal Republic of Germany was promulgated on 23 May 1949 in Bonn. The Provisional Parliament sat. Elections produced coalitions. Political education classes in workplaces described Die freiheitlich demokratische Grundordnung, the free democratic basic order, using printed booklets and blackboards. The emphasis in the early years was on stability and on distinguishing West from East. The Soviets blockaded Berlin in 1948-49. The airlift's mathematics was airfare and calories again. 2,000 flights a day, hundreds of thousands of tons delivered, a city fed by propellers. Children in Kassel collected candy for children in Berlin. They read about the new German Democratic Republic founded in October 1949 and told themselves they were lucky or smarter or both. Denazification diminished as a public act. The Sprüchkammern wound down. The 131er, Article 31 of the Basic Law, permitted thousands of former civil servants removed in 1945 and 1946 to return to pensions and some to office. There were amnesties, explicit and implicit. The judiciary, the police, the ministries refilled with men whose names had appeared in the files. In 1951, the Bundesarchiv holds a circular letter from the Interior Ministry noting the reappointment of former officials when compatible with public confidence. The phrase was a placeholder. Public confidence was not polled, it was assumed, and it was managed. Schoolbooks were rewritten. In the early 1950s, the chapters on the Nazi period were short and careful. They emphasized the Weimar Republic's weaknesses, the takeover by National Socialists, the war, the bombings, the refugees. They did not linger on perpetrators. Victims appeared in numbers and in categories without warm blood. Teachers taught what the books contained. In Kassel's schools, bombed and rebuilt and moved into newer rooms with larger windows, children learned that their parents had suffered too, and it was true. The arithmetic of who had suffered more was a trap set by no one and stepped into by everyone. Contact with former victims continued at the edges. The DP camps emptied as their residents left for the United States, for Canada, for Israel, for Australia. The record in the IRO, International Refugee Organization files, shows embarkations, quotas, and medical screenings. The Mattenberg camp closed. The barracks were dismantled or repurposed. The fences came down. A silence grew in the space where it had been. In some cities, memorials were erected. A plaque here, a stone there. In Kassel, debates in the city council in 1953 about whether to place a memorial at the site of a synagogue burned in 1938 are recorded in stenographic detail. The memorial was modest. Its unveiling did not attract large crowds. He married in 1952 a woman from a village near Fulda, whose parents had taken in a family from Cochise in 1945 and never quite learned to like them. The arithmetic of tables got larger. Food was abundant for the first time since 1939. The Sunday roast reappeared. Wine bottles collected in a cupboard. The flat was 2 rooms plus kitchen in a new block built with subsidies from the 1950 housing construction law. The stairwell smelled of lime and soap. The walls were thin. On one side, a widow, on the other, an expellee couple with 3 children. The politics of the landing was a fog of small grievances and occasional solidarity. Karl wrote less in the notebook. He kept it in the wardrobe, under a stack of towels. He filled it with dates and numbers and names in the margins of work. He wrote the day the first Volkswagen he saw ran as quiet as a sewing machine up the street. He wrote the day his mother, who had not smiled in a decade, laughed at his son falling asleep with a piece of cake in his hand. He wrote the day a man from his office was appointed to a municipal committee despite a file from 1946 that had once barred him from public service. He wrote the sentence, "We live by what we do not say," then crossed it out. In 1955, West Germany entered NATO. In 1956, the Bundeswehr was formed. Rearmament returned uniforms to streets under a different flag and for a different alliance. Men who had had rank found new rank. Recruiting posters emphasized defense, professionalism, and the break with the past. A noisy minority shouted, "Nie wieder Krieg" at rallies on Sundays. The majority went back to work on Monday. The Cold War's mathematics balanced morality and steel plants. Deterrence required hard numbers and plausible promises. The fracture line with the East grew clearer. In June 1953, workers in East Berlin and other cities rose and were suppressed by Soviet tanks. The news cafes in Kassel hummed with commentary. In 1958, the East built new apartment blocks and called them scientific. In 1961, the wall went up. Refugees arrived in trickles and then in bursts. A cousin of Karl's, who had joined the administration in Magdeburg, appeared at the door with a small bag and no papers. He slept on the sofa and spoke little of why he had left. He said, "It is also a country of paperwork over there," then stopped and looked at the tea. Kassel changed again in the long tale of the miracle. The city became a place of art in the late 1950s with the first Documenta, an exhibition dedicated to modern art outlawed in the recent past. Air, concrete, and money built an event where paintings returned from exile. The municipal brochures called it a spiritual reconstruction. The newspapers filled with arguments about taste that were easier to have in public than the arguments about the past. When trials began in Frankfurt in 1963 dedicated to crimes in Auschwitz, a new set of names appeared in headlines. The mathematics of guilt and the arithmetic of rooms were not the same ledger, but they were related. Younger Germans asked older ones where they had been. Older Germans answered, sometimes with anger, sometimes with silence. The files from 1946 and 1947 were consulted. The past that had been turned into categories now was turned into testimony with microphones. In Kassel, people read the papers on trams. In Henschel's canteen, few spoke of it. A man at Karl's table once said, "There were reasons," and stopped because the sentence was going to be heard by ears that had learned not to allow the second clause. The new schools, built with glass and light and the mid-century belief in progress, changed their books again. The photographs on the pages could not be mistaken for anything else. Children asked precise questions. Fathers learned to answer with precise language, or learned to inhale and say, "We did not see," and wait for the subject to change. Some men adopted a harder line. They spoke nostalgically. They gravitated to associations with flags rolled up in the back. The Federal Republic's domestic intelligence services, Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, kept files in cabinets and time on their side. He aged into a man whose tie hid a belly and whose hair thinned. He ran a small section at the factory and read documents with a pencil in one hand. He noticed who got promoted. He noticed the old network names. He noticed the new ones. He attended union meetings. He watched as co-determination became practice and not just policy. He accompanied a friend to a Lastenausgleich office, an office that paid compensation to those who had lost property in the East, with forms that demanded more paperwork than the value of the compensation was worth to collect. In his notebook in 1968, after students in Berlin and Frankfurt marched and shouted, "Unter den Talaren Muff von 1000 Jahren," under the gowns, the musty smell of 1,000 years, he wrote, "They do not know hunger. That is good. They also do not know the arithmetic of keeping a city from freezing. That is also good. They do not forgive. That is understandable. The state, which was built by those who should have been sent home, holds. That is our bargain. That sentence could not have been spoken openly in 1945. It was dangerous then because it implied a pragmatic acceptance of compromised hands at the levers. It was dangerous still in 1968 because it sounded like an excuse to ears that rightfully wanted confessions. The words stayed in pencil on paper. In the 1970s, he watched as memorials began to be larger, as plaques turned into sculptures, as names were spoken into microphones at schools. The expellee associations continued to hold meetings. Their maps of lost provinces hung on the walls of assembly halls. The children yawned and ate cake. The men sang. The women collected donations. The new Germans of Turkish origin began to arrive in larger numbers, invited first as Gastarbeiter and then to stay, and the arithmetic of rooms, food, and jobs opened another column. The city found a new pattern. The public debates shifted. The hard core of what had been done in Germans' names remained where it had always been, in the files, in the bones, in the stories. The Bundesarchiv continued to receive boxes. It listed them. It assigned call numbers. It opened reading rooms. Karl did not come to the reading room. He went to work and went home. He tended a small garden behind the block. His son moved to Frankfurt and wrote in newspapers that used longer words about history. When the old men in his building died, their papers went into bins, or to cousins, or to the city archive, depending on who was on the landing that day. The circulation of paper was one of the ways a country remembered and forgot. He never returned to the Eastern Front lines on a map, to the exact place where his father stopped existing. He stood a long time in front of a black wall covered in names in the municipal cemetery. The wall did not carry his father's name because he had never been officially listed as dead. In those cases, the mathematics of mourning involves not only numbers, but vagueness. The absence was a room without a door. He did not exonerate himself. He did not confess to anything that would have made a court record. He moved on the edge of compromises. He stamped forms. He took advantage of what was available. He gave up on the hope for thorough justice in 1947 and gave up on the hope for thorough exculpation in 1963. He lived like most people, inside the small circle of his family and the larger circle of his city and the larger circle of his country. He kept the notebook. He returned to it at odd hours. He added dates, short sentences, numbers. He wrote in 1972, when the Basic Treaty eased the pressure of the not-quite war across the inner German border, "There will be another country to live with. We will call this a normalization." That word means we will accept what is possible and not tear ourselves apart trying to reach what is not. The city rebuilt itself with patterns of concrete and asphalt that did not match the old streets. The new castle had parking lots and shopping galleries where crooked lanes had stood. It had an exhibition every 5 years which made international critics come and then leave. It had a football club that lost more often than it won. It had a police force with files on extremists from left and right. It had a cultural office that printed brochures that described the Nazi era in 2 pages and the city's cultural offerings in 24. He retired from Henschel in the 1980s. The factory changed hands, restructured, renamed. The trucks were built elsewhere. The city's economy moved to services. He kept the habit of the ledger. He balanced his pension and his rent and his electricity usage as if they were coal deliveries in 1946. He watched the Berlin Wall come down on the television in November 1989. He wrote, "The arithmetic of the Cold War has been annulled. The new mathematics will be unemployment figures, the price of unification, the solvent and the insolvent." He understood the numbers and the pride and the dread. He visited relatives in the East that Christmas. He recognized the smell of kitchens where ration cards had once been kept on nails. In the 1990s, the files kept opening. The newly accessible archives in the East added to the record. The public conversations moved again. His son wrote articles with footnotes that cited Bundesarchiv file numbers. The old men at the Stammtisch grew fewer and the arguments less heated. There was a fatigue to memory. There was also a line of students at the archive door with lists of names and the determination of the young. He made an entry in his notebook late in his life with the same careful strokes he had used in 1945. He wrote the date and then a simple sentence. We were hungry, we were afraid, we did not want to look, and we built, and we taught our children, and we kept many things to ourselves. He did not scratch that line out. In the winter of 2001, he brought the notebook to the city archive and asked if they wanted it. The archivist, younger than his son, nodded. She took it in both hands. She asked where he had lived then and then. She asked if she could note his date of birth. She stamped a receipt. She filed the notebook, which did not look like a document, into a box that did. A quarter-century later, a researcher found it in the catalogue under private papers, anonymous castle resident, and read the first line and stopped because it had the quality of a thesis. When we look at the document dates and sentences and a hand that changes with age, we see the story of a post-war life that is not clean. It is honest in the most dangerous way. It is full of arithmetic, of calories, of rooms, of categories, of wages, of tonnages, of ballots, of ratios, of survival. It is full of mathematics of guilt and of forgetting that is not forgetting, that is not forgetting, that is not forgetting, but the inability to carry everything at once. It is human. It is a credential for a time when everything was a form and a choice. In November of his last year, he sat at the window of the two-room flat and watched the buses. He had a grandson and another coming. He wore a sweater his wife had knit. He thought about the old city that no longer existed, and about the names of men he had stamped forms for, and about the advertisement he had seen once in 1948 that said simply, "Today you can buy butter." He smiled because the sentence had felt like the end of a siege, and because it had been. On 8th of May of 1 year near the end, he wrote one more line in the notebook in a hand that trembled. We built with the same hands that destroyed, and we never said so aloud, and in that silence is the war we lived after the war. He put the pencil down. He closed the book. For Karl, the front line after 1945 ran not across a battlefield but through his memory and his paperwork, and it never moved.